Welcome, everyone, to the 14th episode of the Mystery Hour with Con Sweeney, at our new time of noon Second Life time, or 3 o'clock p.m. Eastern for you folks in real life. Now, to what we're about today. We're a monthly show based here in Second Life. We broadcast live from here on Facebook and YouTube every third Monday of the month at 12 o'clock Second Life time, or Pacific time, again for you folks in real life. We meet mystery authors and others from the publishing world to talk about books and the issues facing them today, from social and technological change. And there's certainly been a lot of those lately. I'd like to thank Draxler Dupre, host of the Second Life Book Club and the Drax Files Radio Hour, both broadcasts from Second Life, for his original sponsorship and the use of the Book Club Island when we first got started. I'd also like to thank Strawberry Linden and Brent Linden for their help in setting this show up. And finally, my eternal thanks to Becky Hansen and Isabel Charon for all their technical assistance in making this happen. Without you, it wouldn't have been possible. Now, our regular viewers may notice that we're no longer on Book Club Island. The reason being that there's a lot going on over there these days, and setting up for our show is becoming a bit of an effort, so we decided to set up our own studio. I finally broke down and decided to pay tier, and here we are. Now, allow me to introduce today's guest. R.G. Belsky, or better known to us as Dick, author of the popular Claire Carlson mysteries, and also writing under the pseudonym Dana Perry, the Detective Abby Pierce mysteries. Dick has had a very interesting career also as a journalist. He was city editor of the New York Post in the 70s, and we're definitely going to talk about that. Welcome, Dick. How does it feel to be in Second Life?
Well, hey, Con, how are you? It's interesting, and I must say, I think I look better than I have in a while. I'm looking at myself there, and I think I look pretty good.
We can thank Becky for that.
Yeah, I gave her a few descriptions of how I wanted to look, so.
Well, great. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey as a writer, and what has life been like for you as a writer during the pandemic?
Well, the first question, of course, for people who don't know me, I've had basically two careers, a lot of it which is merged into one, which is I was, as you pointed out, a journalist for about many, many years in, New York City media, and have written a number of novels sort of based on a lot of real life crime stories that I did or inspired by, as well as my life in the media. But in terms of how the pandemic has affected me, I've actually probably written more during the pandemic than before. I've actually, through a variety of reasons, have had 6 books, I think, came out in the past 2 years. And the one thing about the pandemic is it helps you to focus, because there's not a whole lot else you can do. And so you spend a lot of time, by yourself or indoors or whatever. And so I've accomplished a lot. The downside, of course, is you're not able to go out and meet readers and do all the things a lot of stuff that makes being an author fun. Going to book signings, going to bookstores, meeting people, going to conferences. So I much prefer it, and hopefully we'll all get back to normal. But like most people, I've continued, to write during the pandemic.
Yeah, no, I hope we get back to normal too. And full disclosure to the audience, Dick and I belong to the same chapter of the Mystery Writers of America here in New York, and we were chatting before the show started. We're really hoping to see each other at the holiday party later in December. So, touch wood.
Well, and I'm sure that I'm sure, Con, that there are Mystery Writers chapters obviously around the country, but which are very similar to the one we have in New York. But there's so many events. I mean, the holiday party we talked about, but of course there's readings. I mean, one of the things I've enjoyed is doing readings. You'll read from work, other authors will read. You get to meet other authors, other people, and there's so many different events. And Zoom is fine, but to a point. But there's nothing better than actually being with people.
No, you're right. Last year, as part of my real life business, I was planning on attending many of the writing conferences that take place in the New York City, New England area, and everything just shut down overnight. I knew one fellow. We were talking about him before the show. He had gone out to the West Coast Crime Conference, and they shut it down in the middle.
Yeah, Left Coast. That was that was the beginning of it. People went and they thought it was okay, and then I mean, it wasn't just the conference that shut down. I think it was in like San Diego or someplace, and the city shut it down. The same thing happened with VoucherCon this past summer in New Orleans, and I had decided at the last minute I wasn't going to go because Louisiana was such a sort of hotspot in terms of COVID cases and non-vaccinations. So, and at the last minute they had to close that down too, because they're just things out of everybody's control.
Yeah, no, and unfortunately for VoucherCon, they made the unfortunate decision several years ago to be in New Orleans, right? And who knew it was going to be the hotspot at that time? If it had been any other city, they might have gotten away with it.
And I will say, I mean, New Orleans normally would be a wonderful spot. I went there. They had a conference there 4 years ago, and it was the first time I was ever in New Orleans. And obviously, it's when you plan these things, you never know what is going to happen. So, yeah, for a lot of us, we've missed like VoucherCon. I think we've missed 2 of them now. There was one in Northern California, and then this one. And hopefully it will be better in 2022.
That's what we're all hoping for. So, Dick, can we talk a little bit about your books? I'm always interested with authors, how they develop their characters, how much of themselves they draw on when they create the backstories and the stories themselves that accompany these characters. Could you tell us a little bit about your books and how you develop the characters?
Well, I'm one of these people who tends to follow the axiom of write what you know. I pretty much, all my books are about things I know. They're set in New York City, where I've lived most of my adult life. They're mostly about the media, and if they're not, they're about things like police, which I have some, had connections with in my career in terms of dealing with them. So yeah, that's what I tend to do. Now, my character Claire Carlson, so she, for people that aren't familiar with it, she's a TV news director in New York City, who winds up chasing stories on her own. And obviously, because she's a woman, it's different than me, but I do draw on a lot of my own media experiences. But, I worked with a lot of very talented women journalists over the years in New York, all the way back to the 70s when I started out. The New York Post had some incredibly great women journalists long before, it was so common in the industry. And so I've just drawn on a lot of that and the color. And, my books, one of the things I think that I think people hopefully like about Claire in my books is, it's not just about how she solves murders, but she's a very flawed character. She's a great journalist, but her life is a mess. She's been married 3 times. She's got all these issues. It makes it fun to write, because nobody wants to write a character that's too perfect. Certainly I don't. So I try and make her somehow based on, all these wonderful, colorful, somewhat crazy people that I have worked with over the years in New York City media.
Well, I can certainly attest, since I lived in New York City during that period when your career began and went along, and there were certainly some interesting, crazy characters during that time.
Right, and one of the things people, a lot of people don't really realize too, is they'll say like, well, you created this character, this series, and all these things. When I created the Claire Carlson character, it was not with the idea of doing this right now, Beyond the Headlines, the book, my left, over my shoulder on the left, that is the 4th Claire Carlson, and there'll be a 5th next year. But that wasn't the original idea. I originally wrote a standalone kind of thriller, and I needed a character, and I decided, well, I'll have this woman be the news director of a New York City TV station. But it was supposed to be basically a standalone book. And unfortunately, enough people liked it, including publishers at Ocean View, where I work, who said like, okay, let's keep this character going. Let's do a series. So that's kind of like, it's fun when you do that, because it's like I didn't sit and plan I'm going to do a series about a TV news director. It kind of just evolved, and then you're able to let her evolve, obviously, as the books go on. The one problem that I wish that if I could go back and do it again was in the original book, because I thought I'd never see Claire Carlson again. I made her a TV news director. And the point is, now, she's chasing murders, but you're left with the idea, why is a TV news director, she should be like in budget meetings or ad meetings or something. And of course, no one would read that. So I always, each book, there's a reason why she, is out on the street chasing the murder. I always compare it to something like, I guess, was Macmillan and Wife with Rock Hudson and Susan St. James, where he was the police chief, but he would be out chasing murders. So in each of my books, you'll find there's a reason why Claire has to come out of the office and chase down the murderer herself.
That's good. I think it's called suspension of disbelief, and I think that's one of the things we love about our characters. I mean, not everybody can be Sherlock Holmes and Watson at 221B waiting for somebody to knock on the door saying, we need you.
Well, you talk about suspension of disbelief, which is, or belief or whatever it is. One of the things I always like to talk about when I'm at conferences and stuff about in terms of these books or pretty much any mystery books is, in all the time, and I've been in journalism pretty much my entire life, and all the time I've been in journalism, not only did I never know, I've never heard of a reporter who actually solved a murder on their own. I mean, they've worked with police or something, but I've never heard of a reporter who actually solves a murder. In my books, Claire solves at least one murder, maybe more every book. But that's true almost of any mystery, whether it be a PI. I mean, normally a PI would be sitting going over divorce papers, but instead, he's Philip Marlowe getting knocked over the head and meeting glamorous women. That's really what makes the mystery fun, which is you can't be too real, because if you're too real, you'll be boring. So you need to push it.
Well, look at many of the classic mystery series that are out there that are based in small towns, all over the world. It's like every year there's another couple of murders, and if that happened in real life, I mean, they'd be sending in the National Guard.
Well, do you ever see the numbers on Murder, She Wrote, Jessica Fletcher? It's pretty amazing. I think, I don't have the exact numbers, but like there's a few thousand people in Cabot Cove, and there's been like 300 murders or something. I mean, there's a whole fun thing somewhere online about suggesting that Jessica Fletcher is actually a serial killer herself and doing it. But you kind of got to just, like, in New York, it's a little easier because it's big. But when you're writing now, the series I'm doing now, have been doing now for on Abby Pierce, who's a detective in a small town on Martha's Vineyard, you run into the same thing. I mean, you need to have a sensational crime, and there's not really many sensational crimes on Martha's Vineyard. But again, you don't want to have her giving out parking tickets, so you push it.
Well, yeah, and I think that's why people come back, and it's the quality of the writing, the character development.
I think, one of the things that I've always felt strongly about, both in books I've read and in books I write, is that the most important thing is the character. And if you get the character right, everything else will be fine. I've read so many books where I don't really think the story is all that great, but I love the character, and and I'll follow that character anywhere. And that's kind of what I strive to do. I hope the stories are good too, but that's kind of what I strive to do in Claire Carlson. I mean, like, I go back to people that I've been fans of. Like, I mean, I think I read every Robert Parker Spencer book, and Spencer's a great character. But the stories aren't really that great. I mean, you're reading it to see Spencer with his quips and things, and I've said this, and it sounds sort of sacrilegious to say it because I'm like the biggest Raymond Chandler fan in the world, but I've just picked up a few and read some of his Little Sister and a few of the others, The High Window again, and they're great books, and the character is like the ultimate, Philip Marlowe's the ultimate character. The stories are really not that, they don't really hold together, but it doesn't matter because you love the characters so much. So that's kind of what I work on the most when I'm writing a book too. I want people to follow Claire, whatever she's doing, and they can be outraged by her, they can be amused by her, they can be sympathetic to her, but I want her to bring out those kind of emotions in people.
I think you make a really good point there. I think it's the characterization that really draws people in, supporting characters as well. I know for some of the various series that I follow, I'm almost as interested in the secondary characters as much as I am the main character. It
Yeah.
supports the entire story going forward. And
Well, if you read, I mean, I very recently binge watched because I had sort of been behind the Bosch series on Amazon. Now I've read every Michael Connelly book, and I'm a huge fan. I think he's probably the best, in my view, the best mystery writer of our time right now and most consistent. Um, but when you watch that again, you're struck by all the supporting characters. It's not just the Bosch character. It's it's his daughter, it's the partners, it's the people he's fighting against in City Hall or with the police brass. And yeah, that's a hard thing to do too, to get the right supporting characters and get characters who kind of like in my books, Claire has a best friend who's everything Claire isn't. She's a lawyer, but she's like got this happy life and she seems almost perfect. And I can use that to balance against Claire, whose life is always kind of confused and chaotic. So I think when you can do that, yeah, that is what can make a book really successful.
Uh, good points. Now, another question for you. You're writing this new series with Detective Abby under a pseudonym, Dana Perry. How hard is it to run two series, maintain two personalities? What went into what was the thought process for you behind that?
Well, I mean, it isn't like it was a thought out plan. I mean, I've been doing and loving doing the Claire series, and uh, I was asked if I wanted to do this other series under a pen name, different name, to create a different kind of character and different persona. So it wasn't like I thought it out. I mean, basically, when people want to see things that I've written, I'm sort of like, okay, great, this is terrific. One of the things that I've actually been grateful for is a number of people have told me that the Abby Pierce books read differently than the Claire books. That has some of the same elements in terms of twists and plot and stuff, but that in terms of the character, Abby Pierce has a drinking problem that is not just a cliche, that it literally has affected her life since she was a teenager and affects her today. And so I deal a lot with that. I mean, Claire Carlson has other issues, but it doesn't have that kind of an issue. So it's difficult sometimes, but important to keep the characters different. I mean, you don't want one to sound exactly like the other. And I'm one of those people. I don't jump around on books or characters. I mean, I write one book from beginning to end, and I throw myself into it. And then when that's finished, I wrote two Abby Pierce books, and then I sat down and I started writing a new Claire book this past summer, which I finished and just recently turned in. And it was great. It was like, oh my God, I got this old friend, Claire Carlson. I haven't written her for a few months or 6 months. Now I'm back with her, and yeah, it was for me, it's kind of like meeting an old friend again, and it's fun. If the writing for me, if the writing isn't fun, it's not working. I enjoy being with the character, and I always feel like, okay, if I like Claire and I like being with her, hopefully there'll be readers out there who feel the same way.
Well, obviously are. You're doing very well there. Now, Dick, I'd like to switch gears for a little, and I teased this at the beginning with the audience, but you had a fascinating career as a journalist.
Yeah.
For the folks in our audience who may not be too familiar with New York City, its journalistic history, when Dick was working at the New York Post and later when he moved into television, it was probably the golden age of journalism in New York. Before things began to change, the internet moved in and corporate organizations took over. And he was there for some of the biggest stories in the country. And Dick, could you just tell us a little bit about that time, being the city editor? I mean, Son of Sam, you had the big blackout in '77. Pick your story.
And I should put in a little plug here. If you go on Netflix, there's a 4-part documentary on Son of Sam where I'm actually featured in the first 2 episodes, talking about the summer of '77 with course, Son of Sam, probably the most notorious serial killer ever, was killing women for no reason. And other few other people were basically targeting women in New York City, and so I'm actually on there talking about that. But I mean, that in some ways, I suppose, was the biggest crime story ever, just because of the nature of it. So I was the city editor of the Post in the 70s when that happened, and then through the 80s. And that really was the golden age of tabloid journalism. I mean, for people who either have forgotten it or are too young to know about it, I mean, there was no internet. There were no 24-hour news channels. You got your news in two places. You got your news from a newspaper, or you got it from the TV news. But the TV news was only on, twice a day or whatever, 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock. Again, there was no 24 hours or anything like that. At one point in the 80s, at the high point, the New York Post was selling 1 million copies a day, 1 million copies. And the Daily News was selling much more than that even, and you'd walk past a newsstand and you'd see the story that you did. It would be just sitting there and people would be, getting it. And that was very heady stuff. And we had all these big stories. Rupert Murdoch, we had, giant headlines. Probably the most famous thing that I've ever been associated with, even more than Son of Sam, was a very small crime, which turned out to be a classic headline, which is called Headless Body and Topless Bar. And I did not write that headline, but I was involved in it. And I always tell people, if you Google me as Dick Belsky, one of the things you're going to see a lot of references for is Headless Body and Topless Bar, and I've actually written some articles about it. But the bottom line, it was a murder in a bar in Queens, and for some reason the murderer cut the victim's head off. And the editor at the Post at the time, a man named Vincent Mussetto, came up with this idea: Headless Body and Topless Bar. But we weren't sure it was a topless bar, and so we spent hours trying to do it. This is investigative journalism, and the headline, is probably the most famous tabloid headline ever. So that was very exciting. And then in the 90s, I wound up at Star Magazine, and that was another whole interesting market in journalism, because that was the celebrity magazine. You had the National Enquirer, and you had Star, and then of course you had People and Us. And when I got to Star, we were selling 3.5 million copies a week. 3.5 million people were picking it up at the supermarket, because that's where you got your celebrity news. There was no TMZ, there was no websites, there was none of this. You got your news from there. So it's been quite an interesting thing. And then I finished up my career by spending 6 years at NBC, winding up as a managing editor at NBCnews.com. So I was at 30 Rock, just like the TV show, and that was pretty cool too. So so I've had this long career in journalism, and I've covered like pretty much every big story, whether it be crime or political or, Bill Clinton and sex scandals and all that stuff. But at the same time, I've always been writing books. People say, "Oh, well, you stopped." I've written I think 8 books or something since I left full-time journalism in 2014. And people say, "Oh, so you started writing books when you left?" I'm like, no, I was writing them all the time. And I've always wanted to do that. And I've been able to mix it by, taking a lot of the real life stuff I've covered in the media and turning it into fiction.
Dick, many of the past guests on our show have talked about the changes that are taking place in media, writing, and publishing because of the internet. And you were at the bleeding edge of that for many years. Can you talk about your perceptions of the impact of the internet on journalism, on television? Because I was impressed by the numbers that you just spoke of for the daily sales of the Post and the New York Daily News. And I can remember as a kid walking by the corner newsstand when we still had corner newsstands early in the morning, and big trucks would come by and they would drop off these piles of newspapers that were taller than me.
Yeah.
The Post, the Daily News, the Journal American, the New York Times. I'm dating myself for some of these
Well,
names.
at one point, before I got to New York, there were 12 newspapers in New York.
Yeah.
And when I got here, they were just basically 3, the New York Post, the Times, and the Daily News. But, certainly in the early 60s. The other thing that I don't know that people, it seems it seems hard to believe now, but in the 80s when we were selling 1 million copies a day of the Post was printing for like 18 hours a day. It wasn't like we just came out with a newspaper. It was almost like an internet kind of thing, only it would come out every hour. We would have the first copy of the paper would be out on the morning for people going to work, and then pretty much every hour on the hour we would have a new edition come up, and the stories would change. We'd have stories that happened during the day. So by the last edition that went in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and came out at whatever 5, you had almost a completely new paper with all the live events of the day. And then, so the presses were kind of almost always going back then. And one of the most popular parts of the Post back then was what they called the Wall Street edition, which was the last one. And that would have all the Wall Street stock prices that, at the moment it closed. Now, people are like, why would people care about that? Because there was no other way to get them. You didn't go on the internet and get them. You didn't go on cable, CNBC. There was nothing there. So people would buy it for the stock prices, among other things.
Yeah, no, I can remember, like, with the Daily News, they used to be, there was the 3 or the 4-star edition, and, people would say, well, make sure when you go to the candy store to get me the paper, you get the 4-star, whatever it was. And something else that, you talk about the stock market, reminds me of another story I heard about New York City papers, the illegal numbers racket that was run, where they would take the daily take from the local tracks, and that was used to determine the winning number. People would wait for the newspaper to get that to see whether they won in the illegal lotteries. It was just part of the culture of the city.
Yeah, and we also had one of the things that helped us during the 80s was we ran a contest called Wingo, and it was like a numbers kind of contest, and it was totally legit in the paper, and I think that added about like 200,000 to circulation because people loved that kind of thing. In answer to your, I think, starting out question, which really affects publishing as well as newspapers in many ways. I mean, yeah, the world is completely different now, certainly in terms of journalism. Once the internet, and the internet, a lot of that started slowly. I mean, I remember, the internet, I guess, started mostly during the mid 90s, but even as recently when I was at the Daily News and I think I left that out in my tale of things, but I shouldn't because I spent 5 years and I was managing editor of the New York Daily News. By the time I left the Daily News website basically consisted of the paper every day, and then it would never change. And then the next day, 24 hours later, you would get more on the website. But then around, certainly around 2008 or so, that's when, things like Twitter began and everything changed. I mean, everything is instantaneous. You could find anything out in a minute. It's completely changed, obviously, newspapers. Certainly in a negative sense in terms of, financially, because so many papers have gone out of business, but so many layoffs. Papers that used to sell 1 million copies a day now sell 100,000 copies. And it's also, I think, goes down because most of the people who still buy the print copies are the older people, because young people are reading on their iPad and everything, or their computer or their phones or whatever. So, newspapers obviously are trying to go through an adjustment in terms of, websites, and should there be a pay website? And, some newspapers have some good websites, some haven't. I believe like the New York Post has been very successful recently with their website, and they've generate a lot more emphasis on that, which is really, I think, at this point, the way to go. And there's a lot of advantages to being a journalist on a online, because you can change anything at any moment. I mean, if you have 8 dead in a bombing, and then somebody said no, it's 10 dead or something, you just go in and you can change it. So there are things about it. You have a lot of sites, you have a lot of options, but certainly it's a very difficult period for newspaper journalists. And I think, some of the same is true in publishing. I think, there's a resistance among a lot of people for reading books on Kindle or however you want to read them online. I understand the beauty of the printed book, and I love the printed book, and I have bookshelves all over. But I have gotten to really enjoy the idea of and I think this is where it's headed too. That ebooks and Kindle books because, I mean, number one, you don't have to carry books. If you go on vacation, you want to attend 10 books from you don't. You just take your Kindle or your iPad with you. It's also it's easy to read them. You can make the type bigger. You can find something you're looking for. And I know it's difficult, and I love bookstores and everything too. And I hopefully they'll always be around. But again, I think with younger people, most people who are younger are reading books. A lot more are reading books online, and I just think that's something that's just what it is, and everybody just is going to have to deal with it in terms of the best way you can.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right there. I've been following what's happening with newspapers, magazines in particular, and we're roughly in the same age bracket, and I can remember, the Pan Am building when it was still the Pan Am building,
Yes.
and they had a marvelous, newspaper magazine stand in the lower level, just before we went down to Grand Central, and incredible variety of magazines, newspapers, and I went by there before the pandemic, and now it's mostly snacks and stuff like that. They got a few papers, a couple of magazines, and that's it. Um, and I'm reading about how, in New York City, we've still got two or three major newspapers and probably will manage to survive for a while. Washington has got a couple, Boston, LA, Chicago. But, you just get right outside New York City, and the local newspapers are either dying or they're dead. A couple of things that, I've read that have hurt them were, one, the internet took away the classified ad business, which used to be a big moneymaker for many papers, even at the local level. Advertisements were gone. When I was a young accounting student, more years ago than I remember, I worked at a company called E.J. Corvettes. Some of you in the audience may remember it. If not, go to Wikipedia. And, being a young accounting clerk, I'd be going through all the invoices we'd be paying to artists who created all these ads, which would go into the New York Post, the Daily News, or whatever papers they were going. That whole world is gone now. It's moved online. You no longer have artists. You just have photographers snapping away with their iPhones or whatever gear they're using. Classified ads as such don't exist. People use Craigslist, eBay, or whatever. Pick your tool of choice. But there's other things that we lose there. We lose the local crime beat reporter. We lose the local political reporter. Like in New York State now, there's been some discussion about how Albany, where the state government is being affected by the fact there's no longer the journalistic coverage that there used to be. And politicians don't feel that they're being held as accountable as they once were. And some of them are pushing the edges of the envelope a little bit more than they should. And, what do we lose as a society as this mechanism goes away? And we're still not too sure what replaces it yet.
Yeah, I do think there really is a lot of difference though between what you were talking about and I with newspapers and then the publishing industry, because clearly the number of people who read print magazine newspapers is plunged dramatically because they're getting it online. I don't know that I from everything that I've found, and certainly even during the pandemic, there's an awful lot of people still hungry for books and reading books. And again, some of this may change. I mean, in terms of, you would assume that more people are reading Kindle like during the pandemic than because they're not able to go to bookstores, although now if most bookstores are back open. But I haven't really noticed or heard of there's less people reading books than there ever were. There still seems, and even when you go online and read people and you see people reviewing your books, there's a huge audience, which is great, for not books in general, but also the kind of books that I write and that you cover here, that you're involved with, which is mystery, suspense, and thriller. And I think it's just a matter of, adjusting. There's still hardcover books. There's still paperback. There's Kindle, and then there's Audible too. I know, a lot of people, listen to books Audible, and as far as I'm concerned, anyway, I don't like. I don't really have that much of a, I'm like, I want people to do it this way. I just want people to read or listen to my books, and whatever way they choose to do that, I'm fine with it.
Yeah, no, I think there's certainly a wealth of choices out there now, and while I'll admit I do like the feel of a physical book sometimes when I'm reading, especially over a cup of coffee in Starbucks. But the convenience of having a nook is my tool of choice for reading books. I know my wife certainly appreciates it when we go on vacation, where I used to bring a case of books with me. Now it's just a nook, and she's much happier. Um, and I can take along a lot more books. So yeah, I think having the variety of choices is a good thing. I do feel sorry for um, the small bookshops. I mean, Dick and I happen to live in the same part of the country, and a while back there used to be maybe half a dozen small independent bookshops around here. That from time to time I'd wander through most of them, and I'd try to buy a couple of books, always to support them. But I'd say Dick now probably they're almost all gone. Even the big chain Borders is gone.
Well, that disappeared. Yeah, a number, I think about a decade ago.
Yep.
Borders, but there's still, and a lot of the smaller ones. And I've had the opportunity to deal with many of these in recent years, get to know some of the owners and stuff, and a lot of the smaller bookstores, they have a very dedicated following of people, which is nice. I mean, as opposed to a Barnes and Noble where you go in and you're just looking. But I know, I've held most of my book events over the past few years at the Mysterious Bookshop in New York, which is probably the most famous and biggest still, mystery store around, which is great. And that's a terrific spot, and they've got an audience. There's a place in outside Pittsburgh, Mystery Lovers, where I've done stuff. All these places. There's one near Harrisburg called another one, Mystery Bookstore in Mechanicsburg. I've done stuff there. I'm going to be doing stuff. I think something coming up in December, I think, is planned. And right here in Princeton, we have the Cloak and Dagger bookstore, and Jerry Lenz, who's has been very supportive, and he's the owner of that. So I do think. I'm not as pessimistic. I think there still is a large audience. There's a lot of people who like books, and I think these books are now Barnes and Noble and things. That's a whole different thing. I mean, they're selling a lot of books, but I don't know. I go into Barnes and Noble, and I still see a lot of people in there. So I think there's still an audience. I think there's still an audience for it.
Good. No, I'm glad you're optimistic.
I have to be.
That's true. That's true. Hey, Dick, can you talk about some of your future projects? Are you going to continue your current characters? Are there new ones planned, or new opportunities?
Well, when people say that, I said, people say, what's your, and I said, well, I just turned in my third book in the past year. So it's 3 books I wrote in 1 year, which is, like, for me, is the most I've ever done. And people say, what are you doing? I was like, give me a break. I just, it's like I just turned in 3. But I had two of the Abby Pierce books that came out, the most recent earlier this month, called Silent Island. And then, of course, Beyond the Headlines is the current Claire Carlson. That really just came out in May. So that's still, that's the most current one. And then, you always hope that people, when they read one of the Claire Carlsons, will then go back and read all 4. They're all kind of work as standalone thrillers, even though, there is some background from each to each. But that's true of almost any series. And so the next thing that will be, the next thing that will be coming out will be the new Claire Carlson. That'll be in 2022, and it's called "It's News to Me." And I just finished turning that in. I'm doing like the final edits on it. So that'll be Claire Carlson number 5, and I'm be talking now with everybody about what to do going forward. But right now I've got a couple new books out. I got another one coming out in 2022. So that keeps me pretty busy.
That's good. Sounds like you're filling up your time here. Hey, another question for you. We've talked about the pandemic a couple of times, and one question I have for writers who have been on the show is the great influenza pandemic of 1918 was, until recent times, almost erased from the popular memory. Like, I had, my Irish grandmother came to this country during World War I, crossed the North Atlantic. She talked about what it was like to be on a ship, worried about submarines. She talked about arriving in Brooklyn and getting her life set up. And everything that happened is, she got married, had children, and but never once did she talk about the, the pandemic. If you look at a lot of the literature that was written at that time or just after it, nobody really talked about the great pandemic as such. And I'm wondering if when people start writing about this period in the next several years, maybe the next decade, are they going to ignore the great pandemic of 2022, or are they going to maybe put it into their stories? Would you include the pandemic in your future work?
Well, let me ask you. Let me come in a couple of those. My first answer would be no. I have no plans to write about it. I mean, I know some writers can and will. In my books, at least thus far, the pandemic doesn't exist. I think that's because when I read books, when I watch television shows I like, and when I write books, I kind of want it to be like the world I want to be in, and a world where everybody is, worried about vaccines and masks. I just certainly in the books I've done so far, I have not dealt with it. The other problem with trying to write about the pandemic in a book, and this is true about almost any current event, is that you're going to be outdated because when you start writing a book, it's generally like 18 months or so until the book actually is put out. And I mean, 18 months ago, we didn't even know what COVID was, so I just think there's a lot of problems in doing that, and everything that we've been through and so much has changed. In terms of the 1918 thing, I honestly didn't know much about it either until I, started reading it like you. I mean, I may have heard something about it, but yeah, I didn't even realize that something like that had happened. I think the big difference, of course, between 1918 and 2020 or 21 and 21 is that I mean our social media, everything. I mean, we talk about everything is out there. In 1918 there was nothing. I mean, there was no television, there was probably barely radio. I'm not sure when radio actually was invented, but people got their news in a very slower way, and things just didn't keep in the same way. So I would think that with everything that's been done on it now, I would think that it would be an incredible moment in history that will never be forgotten because it changed our whole world so much. So one of the things for me personally, people talk about, did you ever see anything like this? The only thing that came close, I remember when I was really young, and I mean, I was probably like under 10 years old, is polio. And people who weren't around what a horrific, scary thing polio was, certainly like in the early 50s. I think we all knew people who, young people, children, a lot of them kids, teenagers who had got it. They wound up like in iron lungs. They couldn't breathe. They had died. It was a terrifying thing. And then, the Jonas Salk vaccine, it kind of just disappeared. But I knew people who got polio, and that was like a really scary moment back in the early 50s. And I think that was the biggest thing like this although it certainly doesn't come close to changing the way we live like the pandemic did, but that was the biggest disease thing I ever remember in my life before this.
Well, no, you're right there, because I can remember growing up that when I came of school age, the vaccine was out there. We got our vaccine shots. We got the booster shots at school. But people talked about polio like it was a big deal. I can remember parents, relatives, teachers talking about it, and there was the diligence to make sure everybody got vaccinated, everybody got their booster shots. But you never heard of anybody in my age bracket getting polio. It was older children, older people who had it. Likewise, when I was growing up, as a child, you were expected in your early years of grammar school, you were going to get measles, chicken pox, and mumps. I got all three. I got my merit badge. I don't have children myself, but with my friends and family who do have children, and I don't think any of those kids ever had any of those diseases. Again, thanks to vaccines and the way we change how we do things. So I guess maybe you made a very good point earlier about reading, especially fiction, being escapist in a way.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
want to leave our problems behind us. We don't want to jump into a world where we've got to socially distance, we got to mask, and we got to worry about, which vaccine we got.
Yeah. Again, I think again, that's why I read books. That's why in my books, it's kind of an escapism. I think one of the mistakes people talk about is they say, "Oh, you need to make your book really like fiction. You got to make it authentic and real." And like people say to me, like, "Wow, you really know how a newsroom works, and it's so accurate. You portray this accurate version of the newsroom." Well, not really. I don't really, because the newsrooms in my books, I mean, they're not real newsrooms. In a real newsroom, people come to work every day. They're bored. They do nothing. They can't find a big story. They eat lunch. They go home. It's like a lot of jobs. But when you're writing it, you want to make it different. You want to make it exciting. So if somebody says to you, "Oh, wow, your book is exactly," and I think that's true of anybody, a private investigator, it's like you don't want to make it authentic. You want to make it authentic enough that it seems
Mhm.
real. Then you want to make it interesting. It's a fictional world. My favorite story was a Raymond Chandler story, and I've talked about this, but somebody once criticized Philip Marlowe, and they said in a book, and they said, "Well, this is ridiculous. Private eyes don't get knocked on the head every moment they walk in a room. They don't meet beautiful blondes. That's not real." And Chandler's response was, "Absolutely, it's not real at all. But if I wrote about what a private investigator really did all day, nobody would read me." And to me, that sums up what I try and do in my writing.
Yeah, no, I'm laughing. A client of mine, he's a private investigator out in California, and he's a retired FBI agent. And he describes what he does as a private investigator. And really, 95% of what he does are background investigations for corporate employers.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
He said, I spend a lot of time, using online tools, phone calls. Occasionally I meet people. He said, but yeah, he said, if you think I'm out there, he says, yeah, I do have a permit to carry, but he says, I can't remember the last time I carried it.
But and it just again with this idea of it not being real but pushing stuff, it's like my character Claire Carlson. If she really did in real life did all the things in a newsroom that I have her doing, she'd probably be fired on the first day. Like talking back and breaking rules and all that. And I mean, it's a fictional thing. I got a chance to interview, and very well-known author Ace Atkins, and Ace Atkins now writes the Robert Parker Spencer books. He took over after Robert Parker died, and he said that once that he had interviewed he had talked to Robert Parker, and basically the bottom line was on Spencer was that Spencer says all the things that you wish you said. When you're in a situation, you leave and you go, "God, I wish I'd said that." Spencer says them at the moment when he should say that, and most people don't do that in a book. And I feel like I try and do that with Claire. I try or have her do a lot of the things I wish I could do, but I never probably would have the guts or courage to do it. But in my book, she gets away with it.
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I've had that experience many times reading fictions, particularly mysteries and thrillers, where, the main character does something and you cringe and you go like, I never could have done that myself, but I wish I could have. Um, yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. I know what you mean. Another question for you, Dick, is, I know you're spending a lot of time writing and not doing too much else with the pandemic, but what have you been reading, if anything, during this pandemic?
Well, it's an interesting question. I've read a couple books recently that I would like to mention. One of which is uh, uh, by a guy. I don't know if you ever heard of this guy. He's an author named Stephen King. Is that familiar with you?
Yeah, yeah, I think I have. But we try to get him
Yeah.
on the show, but he's always busy.
I've been a Stephen King fan. I haven't read all his books. He's written so much, but I started reading Stephen King back when I started writing. He's one of the people, not just a mystery person, that inspired me. So I started reading him back in the '70s with Salem's Lot and Dead Zone and all that. And he's an incredible writer. Now, most of his books are kind of like horror based, but he also writes some pure thrillers.
Yes.
And he recently came out with a book called Billy Summers, which is there's no supernatural, there's no horror. It's just basically a story about a hired gunman, a hitman who has this big job and wants to retire. And it's kind of a classic thriller. But in the hands of Stephen King, it's really brilliant, and I was like really blown away again by that. I mean, I'm a huge fan of everything Michael Connelly's done. I've had the chance to meet him a few times, talk to him. He's got a new one coming out in November. I'm looking forward to that, which is a new Harry Bosch with Renee Ballard, who's like the new partner he's with. I just read a book by another journalist friend of mine called Julia Dahl, which has gotten all sorts of acclaim, called The Missing Hours. I can't really talk a lot about it other than to say it's about a woman who goes through a horrendous experience and then tries to get the answers and tries to make it right again what happened to her. And so that's one I just actually finished, and I know Julia's got a lot of acclaim on it. Julia's a former reporter for the New York Post, by the way, so that's why I have some bonding with her, and although many years after I was there. So those are some of the more recent books I've read. I also like going back. Like I said, I recently read, I'll pick up a Raymond Chandler or Michael Connelly or Robert Parker or Sue Grafton, and I'll just read it again. Some for pleasure, but also some to see, how they handle things, and to kind of learn from people who are so great at what they do.
Yeah, you just listed some really great authors in that summary there. I think the mystery thriller genre has been very fortunate over the years. They've had some incredibly talented, creative writers, men and women who just were able to sit down in front of a blank piece of paper, just like you, and create some wonderful stories to entertain the rest of us.
Yeah, somewhat one I read a lot of her stuff, and I got a chance to meet her. Is Sue Grafton, who wrote Kinsey Malone, because Kinsey Malone obviously is a woman character, and a kind of like flawed character, somewhat like a Claire Carlson. I actually really enjoyed a lot of Sue Grafton stuff, who unfortunately died much too early a few years ago. But I think she got up to like Y, or she pretty much got to the.
She got to Y.
Such a great gimmick to the the A is for alibi, the B is for burglar. I mean, the books were great, but the idea too was such a catchy commercial thing. And she was, I had a few exchanges with her. I met her once at a conference. Really terrific person too.
Yeah, she was a gifted writer. I'm about halfway through the alphabet with her, and I hadn't realized how ill she was, and when I learned a couple of years ago that she had passed away.
Yeah.
And that's going to be, I think, one of those great, unanswered questions in the world of mystery thrillers. What would
Z have been?
What would Z have been? And
she was also a great, huge proponent of the mystery genre, the mystery thriller genre. And I'm sure there are certain people probably in the literary world who kind of look down on it a bit. It's kind of, well, they're not real novels. These are like crime things. It's not an important, serious novel. And I was at an event once where Sue Grafton was talking about that, and she had written all these other books, and that people would say, well, why don't you write a real important novel? Why don't you write a real novel instead of this stuff you're doing? And why don't you read this? This is a real novel. And she said, every time I read one of these novels that people tell me is a real novel, she said, I start turning the pages and all of a sudden I put it down and I say, when is something going to happen? And because that is the great thing about a mystery. There's always something happening, and it just grabs you and keeps your attention. So she had a really, really good take on it.
I think Sue Grafton, like yourself and all the other authors we've been talking about, you're all great storytellers. Go back to the beginning. When we were sitting around in animal skins around a fire at night, people told stories. Mm-hmm. They told stories that drew people in. Things happened. Nobody sat around giving great philosophical tomes around the campfire. And I think that's why, if you look at writers like yourself, Sue Grafton, you make pretty good livings from writing mysteries and thrillers, whereas the great literary novels, they sell maybe one or two, but not too many after that.
Well, and the other thing about writing a mystery novel is this is a question that comes up a lot too, is, how do you do it? Do you have the outline? Do you do all that stuff? And everybody does it different. I know, like Jeffrey Deaver talks about, he does a 200-page outline before he writes a book, but I'm very much of a, I don't know, when I write a book, when I write a Claire Carlson book, I have a beginning and I have a sort of an idea where the ending is going to be. And then, I just start throwing all sorts of questions in there and raising issues and things she doesn't know. And then, at some point in the book, I have to go back and, and answer all these things. So when I start writing a book, to me, that helps because I think it all these twists and turns and not knowing stuff. I mean, I don't know the answers to a lot of point, and I have to figure out what the answer is. Or maybe I decide, well, I shouldn't go in that direction. But it's kind of an adventure to me when I sit down and write one, which I just find a lot more fun to do that than sitting out and I never plot the book out beforehand. So.
Yeah, and I've been at a couple of conferences where there have been raging debates between they call themselves pantsers and the planners.
There's plotters and pantsers, yeah.
Plotters, and it's like all in between. And I think whatever works for you and makes a good story, that's the important thing.
Like you might, like in Beyond the Headlines, for instance, I started off with a reference to Vietnam. Now, I was in Vietnam, whenever, in the late 60s. And I suddenly turned that into a big part of the book. It's not all the book, but as I got into it, I was like, well, I'm really interested. I'm going to keep going in this. And I didn't start it out like this, but you'll find that Vietnam and secrets from years and years ago, 50 years ago, play a role in the book. And I sort of discovered that. And you can do that with characters too. You might write a character who you think's only going to be on there for a page or whatever. And then you're like, wow, this character's taking me places. And I think, as a writer, if you find that your character is taking you places you didn't expect to go, that's pretty cool, and to me, I think it's more effective than sitting down and putting down in an outline what you want to happen. To a great degree, I let Claire lead me through the book and see where I'm going to go. So hopefully that's good for the reader too.
Oh, I'm sure it is. And thank you for sharing that with us. We're coming to the end of our hour together here, Dick, and I want to thank you for joining us today. This has been really informative and enjoyable, and I'm sure our audience is enjoying it, and we're enjoying it. We'll continue to enjoy it on replay on YouTube.
And such a nice, whatever it is, living room you've got me hosting in here. This is your new place. This is very nice, yeah.
This is the new studio. We can thank you for that. I hope to have you back sometime in the future when you get your next books coming out. And give us an update. Life after the pandemic, hopefully. To the audience, I'd like to say thank you for joining us. Please remember you can see this on Facebook or on YouTube. We'll be back on Monday, November 15th at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. We'll be having two guests and more details on them, talking about their work in the world of mysteries. So please contact me at Con Sweeney at Samedi.com if you have any suggestions for panelists, ideas for the shows, or if you wish to participate yourself. I'm learning, after doing this for over a year, that putting on a show like this isn't easy. So if you'd like to volunteer to help out with our stage crew, please let me know. Send me a note, either in Second Life or outside, and we'll be in touch. But for now, thank you all for joining.